Now some amazing scientific proofs of creation.
Do your worst.
Evolution is shot full of inconsistencies. Evolutionists have seized on many theories within the overall theory in an attempt to explain the origins of plants, animals, the heavens, and the earth.
Sure, our understanding of evolution has ways of explaining life as we know it, but they're not inconsistent. If it was, it wouldn't be very well accepted within the scientific community. But I'm sure you're going to give us an example.
Over and over, these theorists try to explain how life evolved from inanimate material into more complex life forms until reaching the pinnacle, human beings.
The theory of evolution does not encompass abiogenesis. We understand far more about evolution than abiogenesis. And you do understand that the word theory does not mean the same thing in a scientific sense as it does normal usage, right? You do understand the difference between a theory and a hypothesis, don't you?
Yet, as one geologist wrote, it must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have been debunked.
Such as, just because this one person said it in a cherry-picked quote does not mean that it's true. We need some support behind this assertion.
The biggest reason so many theories within the overall theory of evolution collapse.
Like what? You keep saying that, but you haven't actually shown an example. As far as I'm concerned, that hasn't yet happened, at least not to the ideas that the scientific community holds today.
Is because they contain terrible logic, requiring great leaps in faith to believe.
Kinda like how God populated the earth via incest twice? Or how somehow every animal was held on a really big boat and survived for quite a long time. And afterwards, somehow from that central spot, animals made it all the way to Australia and to Americas. What about the fact that God had to create different languages and separate peoples simply because they wanted to build a really tall tower? Or what about how God had to send himself down so that he could sacrifice himself to himself in order to appease himself? And somehow this was the only way to stop him from torturing people eternally for a finite crime. And how God's wrath is worse than any man has put on any other man, yet somehow we all deserve it. I don't see that many illogical statements in the idea that organisms can change over time.
Here is one example of a debunked theory.
Alright, about time. It's the only one you're going to give, so I hope it's something good.
Many evolutionists have tried to argue that humans are 99% similar chemically to apes, and blood precipitation tests do indicate that the chimpanzee is people's closest relative. Yet regarding this, we must observe the following. Milk chemistry indicates that the donkey is man's closest relative. Cholesterol level tests indicate that the garter snake is man's closest relative. Tear enzyme chemistry indicates that the chicken is man's closest relative. On the basis of another type of blood chemistry test, the butter bean is man's closest relative.
Again, you're quoting a highly criticized creationist, which shows an obvious bias on your part, but there's no source cited in this assertion. I was unable to find any information on any of these tests, but at any rate, it doesn't really mean anything, and here's why. When comparing percentages of how similar one organism is to the other, what they're comparing is DNA, not the chemical composition of their blood, or their milk, or their tears, or the enzymes found in them. But even so, comparison of DNA of different animals hasn't really happened as we think it has. Most of what you hear about that is just misinformation. So, believe it or not, no scientist relies on this information. So even if you did debunk it, it means nothing.
More people should weep for evolutionists.
By weep for, do you mean genuinely try to understand from an unbiased perspective the positions of?
Let's consider the incredible complexity of life. Everyone has witnessed explosions. Have you ever seen one that was orderly?
Define orderly.
Or one that created a watch or a clock, or a single thing of exquisite design instead of chaos and destruction?
No, because that's obviously not how explosions work, and that's not how those things are manufactured. What's your point?
Consider the next quotes involving the likelihood of an explosion creating the entire natural realm of life on Earth, let alone the beautiful magnificence and order seen no matter how far one looks into space.
Here's the thing, life did not come out of an explosion.
Dr. B.G. Ranganathan said, "The probability of life originating from accident is comparable to the unabridged dictionary resulting from an explosion in a printing shop."
Well, here's the thing. Life didn't appear by accident. Accident means that something happened that was against someone's intentions, but there was no intention. It'd be more accurate to say it was perchance, but even that would be wrong. Life formed from natural processes.
The English professor of astronomy at Cambridge University, Sir Fred Hoyle, also stated, "The chance that higher forms have emerged in this way is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein."
Key phrase, "in this way." See, Fred Hoyle was talking about the probability of complex life appearing in one step, which it did not. All that was needed for life to start out was something that could replicate and that could change as it replicated. This could have just been several RNA strands that formed out of convenient circumstances.
Consider the common mousetrap. Everyone is familiar with it, and most have used one. Which part of a mousetrap could you remove and it would still work? The answer, none. While ingenious, it is still a very simple mechanism. Since the mousetrap cannot be made any simpler, it represents a condition called irreducible complexity.
Oh dear.
Certain living organisms also cannot be simplified or reduced in complexity and survive. The removal of any one part causes the system to cease functioning. Irreducibly complex systems cannot be produced gradually by slight successive modifications from a less complicated precondition.
That's not true at all. Just because it's irreducibly complex does not mean that it couldn't have come from something that was simpler. Maybe the whole thing relies on all of its parts. That doesn't really say anything, because the individual parts didn't evolve one at a time. They evolved together. And they all could have evolved from a form of itself which wasn't as complex. Take, for example, the eye, because some creationists like to use the eye. If we have an eye that is half as complex, same parts, but not as good parts, and it only works half as well, having that half-functioning eye is still better than having no eye at all. So if you have an animal that has no eye and it evolves into something that kind of works a little bit like an eye, that animal would be better off than the animal without one, and it would strive more. And if that animal in turn evolved into an animal that had a more complex, better working eye, which it very well could, then that animal would survive more. And eventually it could evolve into this eye that works half as well as the eye we know today. And through tiny, tiny steps, it can evolve into the eyes that we know today.
They must exist exactly as they are, whole, complete, or they cannot exist at all.
Not true. It's just that if it doesn't exist as we know it today, it wouldn't quite work the way we know it works today. A simpler form could work in a simpler way, a more complicated form could work in a more complicated way, and messed up versions could not work at all. But this is a false dichotomy.
Take away any part and they cease to function and therefore to live.
But that doesn't mean it couldn't have evolved.
What are the implications of this? Charles Darwin, in his famous work, The Origin of Species, framed a giant problem for him and all evolutionists. If it could be demonstrated, he wrote, that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Those are his words.
Funny, I was reading about this the other day. Darwin's next sentence was, "But I can find no such case." And to this day, we have found no such case.
The next part of this series will continue examining irreducible complexity.
Well, I may have said enough about it, so I might skip that bit.
And more powerful proof of the existence of God.
Wait, hold on. Proof in the existence of God? Come to think of it, at the beginning of this video, you did say,
Now some amazing scientific proofs of creation.
But I have yet to see that. Even if what you said was true, which it certainly is not, you wouldn't have proven the existence of God. You've just attempted to disprove evolution. If you did that, it would not be a logical conclusion to say that God exists, just that we were wrong. The existence of God has to be proven just as any other hypothesis. You don't get a free pass as being the default stance.
In the meantime, request our free booklet.
No, don't tell me what to do.